I've been camping dozens of times before, so I wasn't too concerned when my friend Ethan suggested we camp deep in the woods this weekend. It'll be off the grid, he said. No cell service, no other people for miles. Just us, nature, and the stars. I liked the idea. I needed a break from the noise of the city. So we packed up, drove 2 hours away, and headed towards the campground. By the time we arrived, the sun was already sinking, casting long shadows between the trees. The woods felt different than I expected. Quieter, like even the birds didn't bother coming this deep. I chalked it up to remote how we were, and shrugged off the unease creeping up the spine. We set up camp, built a fire, sat back, watched the flames dance as darkness settled around us. For the first couple of hours, it was everything Ethan had promised. Peaceful, serene. The crackling fire, the distant hoot of an owl, the cool night air. It all felt perfect. But when Ethan went to gather more wood, something changed. I was sitting alone by the fire, poking at the embers, when I heard it. Something moving in the trees behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight into the woods. The beam swept across the trees, illuminating nothing but empty forest. I laughed at myself for getting spooked so easily. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Then I heard it again. This time it was closer. A slow, deliberate rustling, like someone or something was walking through the underbrush, moving in my direction. I stood up, calling out, "Ethan, is that you?" No answer. I felt a chill in the air, and suddenly, the quiet that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt suffocating. I kept my flashlight trained on the trees, my breath coming in short. Silence. The rustling had stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything, any indication of what might be out there, but it was dead quiet now. The kind of quiet that presses down on you, thick and unnatural. I glanced back at the fire, wishing Ethan would hurry up. A twig snapped behind me. I whipped around and pointed the flashlight in the direction of the sound. There, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. Tall, thin, almost blending into the shadows. I could just make out the shape of a person, standing completely still, as if they were watching me. I froze. "Ethan?" I called, my voice shaking, even though I knew it wasn't him. The figure didn't move. I could barely see its face, but the eyes, they were staring right at me, cold and unblinking. I felt my skin crawl, my instincts screaming at me to run. But before I could move, the figure took a step forward, and I caught a glimpse of its face. Pale. Too pale. Like it didn't belong to someone living. Its mouth was open, just slightly, like it was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a log, my heart racing. I wanted to yell, but my throat tightened, and all that came out was a strangled whisper. That's when Ethan came crashing through the trees, arms full of firewood. "Hey man, I found some..." He stopped short, seeing the look on my face. "What's wrong?" I pointed toward the figure, but when I turned to look, it was gone. The space where the figure had just been standing was now empty. Just shadows shifting in the light of my flashlight. There was someone there. Right there. Ethan frowned, scanning the woods with his own flashlight. I didn't see anyone on my way back. Maybe it was a shadow or an animal. No, I saw someone. Ethan shrugged it off, tossing the firewood down and stoking the fire again. "You're probably just tired. Let's get some rest. Nothing's out here, man." But as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin walls of the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every rustle of the wind, every crack of a branch made my heart jump. And that face, it kept replaying in my mind, pale, hollow, watching me. Around midnight, I heard it again. The same slow, dragging footsteps circling our camp. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard something else. A soft whisper, barely audible, like someone speaking under their breath. My name. I bolted upright, clutching my flashlight, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was low, casting flickering shadows across the campsite. I scanned the perimeter with my light, but again, there was nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement, something darting between the trees. I crawled out of the tent, flashlight shaking in my hand. I could barely make out the figure, but it was there again, just standing in the distance, staring. And then it spoke. "Come here." The voice was low, barely a whisper, but it wasn't just coming from the figure. It was all around me, echoing through the trees. I stumbled backward, shouting for Ethan, but he didn't stir. I turned, running toward his tent, but as I reached it, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were running, fast, rushing through the trees, coming straight for me. I didn't wait. I dove into Ethan's tent, shaking him awake. "Get up, we have to go, man!" What the hell? Ethan mumbled, groggy and annoyed, but I didn't have time to argue with him. I grabbed my backpack, my hands trembling, and dragged him to his feet. We didn't stay to pack up the tents. We left everything behind, running blindly through the dark, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods. I don't know what I saw that night, and I didn't care to find out who it was. But one thing is for sure, those woods weren't empty. Something was out there, something that shouldn't be, and it was looking for us. My car broke down at the worst possible time. I was driving back from a late meeting, taking the back roads to avoid traffic, when the engine just sputtered out. 1 minute, I was cruising along with nothing but trees on either side, and the next, the dashboard lit up with warnings, and the car coasted to a stop, dead. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my phone. No signal, of course. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town. My headlights illuminated the narrow road ahead, winding deeper into the woods, but beyond that, it was pitch black. I sat for a minute, trying to figure out what to do. It was late, almost midnight, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. The woods on either side of me were dense, the trees towering ahead. There was no way I was going to stay in the car all night, hoping someone might pass me by. With no other choice, I grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and stepped out of the car. The night air was cool, and the forest was so quiet it felt unnatural. I could hear my own footsteps crunching on the gravel as I started walking down the road, hoping I'd eventually find a house or a gas station. After about 15 minutes of walking, the road started to curve, and I noticed something strange. Up ahead, just beyond the bend, there was a faint light filtering through the trees. It didn't look like headlights, more like the glow of a lantern or a campfire. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe someone lived nearby or was out for a night hike. Either way, I figured I could ask for help. I quickened my pace, the flashlight beam bouncing in front of me as I approached the light. But as I got closer, something felt off. The light wasn't moving, and there were no voices, no sounds of people, just a faint glow flickering in the darkness. When I rounded the bend, I stopped dead in my tracks. The road ended abruptly at a clearing, and in the middle of that clearing was an old, dilapidated cabin. The light was coming from inside, casting eerie shadows through the cracked windows. The place looked abandoned, run down with boarded up sections of the roof and vines creeping up the sides. But someone had to be inside, right? I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told me to turn around and keep walking, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone be in that cabin, especially this late? And if they were, why hadn't I heard them? I stepped off the road and walked toward the cabin. The flashlight flickered in my hand as I approached, and I found myself holding my breath. There was no movement inside, no sounds of life, just the light, burning low like a lantern sitting on the floor of the cabin. I reached the front door and hesitated. It was slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pushed it back and forth. I leaned forward, peering through the crack. The inside was just as run down as the outside, dusty with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, old furniture rotting away in the corners. But then I saw it. In the center of the room where the light was coming from, there was a lantern sitting on the floor, and around it, barely visible in the dim light, were dozens of footprints. They circled the lantern in a chaotic pattern, as if people had been pacing around it for hours. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The footprints looked fresh, too fresh. I pulled back the door, my skin crawling. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. Just as I turned to leave, a noise stopped me in my tracks. A soft creak, like the sound of a floorboard shifting under weight. I whipped around, shining my flashlight through the doorway, but the room was empty. No one was there. But I heard it again, louder this time, creaking like footsteps coming from the back of the cabin. Suddenly, the lantern inside flickered and went out, plunging the clearing into the darkness. I stumbled back, tripping over a rock as I tried to put distance between myself and the cabin. My flashlight flickered, threatening to die, and for a moment, I was completely enveloped in the blackness of the forest. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something or someone was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. It was tall, its figure barely visible through the trees. I froze, unable to move, my mind racing. How long had it been standing there? How long has it been watching me? Before I could react, the figure stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a step back, then another, but my legs felt like lead. I heard it again, the sound of creaking floorboards, but this time it wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from the woods all around me. Multiple footsteps closing in. Without thinking, I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face and the underbrush clawing at my legs as I sprinted back toward the road. I didn't dare look back. The footsteps were right behind me now. Fast, relentless. My flashlight flickered, barely lighting the way, but I pushed forward, desperate to reach my car. When I finally burst out onto the road, I didn't stop. I ran straight to my car, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my eyes scanning the darkness outside. For a few agonizing moments, there was nothing, just the empty road and the stillness of the night. Then, from the woods, I saw the figure step onto the road, standing just at the edge of my headlights. It was still, watching me, as if waiting for something. I fumbled with my keys, praying the car would start, and to my disbelief, the engine roared to life. Without a second thought, I slammed my foot on the gas and tore down the road. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, the cabin in the woods far behind me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of those trees. Something that didn't want me to leave. I wasn't supposed to be in the woods that night. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, the kind of thing you regret almost immediately. I had gone for a drive to clear my head, taking winding country roads out into the middle of nowhere. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when I realized I had no idea where I was. My GPS had lost signal about an hour back, and the narrow dirt road I was following was barely visible under the dim glow of my headlights. I told myself I'd just turn around at the next clearing, but when I saw a small gap in the trees, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over to the side of the road, left the engine running, and stepped out of my car. The woods were dense, the trees pressing in on either side, their branches like skeletal arms stretching toward the sky. There was something eerie about how quiet it was, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I should have stayed by the car. I should have just turned back. But instead, I found myself walking toward the tree line, drawn by an unexplainable pull. Maybe it was the desire to escape from my thoughts, to get lost in something bigger than myself for a while. Or maybe it was just pure stupidity. I stepped into the woods, the air cooler here, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. My footsteps were muffled by the soft undergrowth, the crunch of leaves the only sound breaking the silence. As I moved deeper, I pulled out my phone, hoping to use the flashlight, but it was dead. It was strange how dark it was in there, like the trees swallowed up all the remaining light. After a few minutes of walking, I stopped to take in my surroundings. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, forming an impenetrable wall of black. The sense of isolation was immediate and suffocating. I turned to head back to the car, but as I did, I heard something. A low, rustling sound like leaves being disturbed. I froze, ears straining in the silence. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but there was something deliberate about the noise. It was like steady footsteps. I took a few cautious steps back towards the road, my heart starting to race. The rustling grew louder. This time, it was accompanied by the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, heavy, and close. Too close. I glanced around, but saw nothing in the darkness. My pulse quickened, and I started walking faster, the uneasy feeling in my stomach growing. The breathing followed me, staying just out of sight, just beyond the trees. It was like whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be seen. I broke into a run, my legs carrying me back toward where I thought the road was. But the more I ran, the more the trees seemed to close in around me, their thick branches twisting together like a living wall. I couldn't see the road anymore, and panic started to set in. The footsteps behind me sped up. I could hear them clearly now, heavy and fast, crashing through the underbrush. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. But there was no logic here, only fear, pure, primal fear. I stumbled over a root, crashing to the ground. Pain shot up my leg as I scrambled to my feet. I risked a glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing. No movement, no figure, just the darkness pressing in around me. I kept running, the pain in my leg growing with every step. My vision blurred as sweat dripped into my eyes, and my thoughts were reduced to a single desperate plea. Find the road, find the car, get out. Then, up ahead, I saw it. A faint glimmer of light through the trees. My car. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. As I neared the tree line, I heard the footsteps again. Louder now, closer than ever. I burst through the trees and onto the dirt road, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. My car was right there, engine still idling, headlights cutting through the night. I sprinted toward it, adrenaline pushing me forward despite the pain. Just as I reached the driver's side door, I heard someone speak. "Why did you leave?" The voice was low and coming from behind me. My skin crawled as I yanked the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut. I locked the doors and stared through the windshield, my heart pounding. I couldn't see anything in the road behind me. No figure, no person, just the empty stretch of dirt road disappearing into the trees. For a moment I sat there, gasping for my breath, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The rational part of my mind told me to drive, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. I was frozen, my mind replaying that voice over and over. Then something moved, just beyond the reach of the headlights in the trees to the right of the car. I saw it, a figure, standing still, watching. It was tall, with arms too long and legs too thin. It looked human, but wrong, as though it had been stretched or distorted. It didn't move, it just stood there, half hidden in the shadows, its head tilted slightly as if waiting for something. With shaking hands, I threw the car into gear and slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun for a moment on the dirt before catching, and the car lurched forward. I sped down the road, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The figure didn't follow, but as I drove off, I realized something that made my blood run cold. When I'd stepped out of the car earlier, I'd left the driver's side door open, and when I'd ran back to the car, it had been closed.